with today's agenda. We will hear 5 presentations, after which the panel will have the chance to ask questions to the presenters. We will start with FDA's presentation from Jessica Paulson, who is the Associate Director for Digital Health in the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality at CDRH. Ms. Paulson, you may come up and begin. Thank you.
All right, good morning. So I'm Jessica Paulson. I'm the Associate Director for Digital Health in our Office of Product Evaluation and Quality at FDA, and I'm excited to be here to chat with you about some approaches for managing changes for AI-enabled devices. So we're going to start by, again, underlining the importance of a Total Product Lifecycle or TPLC approach, and then I want to focus on 2 different approaches for post-market monitoring, including special controls and predetermined change control plans, or PCCPs, which you've heard a little bit about, but we're going to do a crash course together. So FDA has long promoted a total product lifecycle approach to regulating medical devices, including AI-enabled devices. This has become increasingly relevant and important for medical devices that are incorporating technologies that are intended to iterate or change at a much faster pace than ever before throughout their life cycle. So this really helps us push our needs to consider how manufacturers can effectively monitor the post-market performance of their AI-enabled devices to make sure that these devices continue to be safe and effective throughout their life cycle as they change. So very briefly, I did want to mention that we have worked collaboratively within the international harmonization and regulator community, focused on establishing good machine learning practice guiding principles. These aim really to facilitate the development and assessment of high-quality AI/ML-enabled technologies. And I mention these just to, again, underline the importance of total product lifecycle approach, which is listed in the guiding principles, as well as the need for good performance monitoring of these technologies. And I did want to take a moment also to just share about the current landscape. So the number of FDA-authorized AI-enabled devices continues to increase. We update our list periodically. This list is maintained on our website. We are at, as of the last update this past summer, 950 AI-enabled devices that have been authorized by FDA. And I did want to make it very clear, we have not authorized any generative AI-enabled devices, nor have we authorized any adaptive AI-enabled devices. That said, I thought it would be helpful to share an example of a recent authorization for an AI/ML-enabled device. This is the Sepsis Immunoscore. So this software is intended to identify patients at risk for having or developing sepsis. So the way this software was designed is that it uses data from a patient's electronic health record in conjunction with other lab tests and clinical assessments to really aid in the risk assessment for the presence of or progression to sepsis. So given this intended use and the nature of this design or this device, it's important that it continue to perform as intended throughout the life cycle and in the real world setting. So as part of the de novo process, and we do this for all de novos, we evaluate the risks associated with that product, and to mitigate those risks, we establish special controls or requirements for that device type to again, mitigate those risks. So thinking about this example specifically, a couple of the risks that came up during that review are the risk of bias, as well as risk of poor quality or missing input data for that device type. So the new regulation actually included a special control that requires manufacturers to develop and implement a post-market performance management plan. That is just one of the special controls, but again, given the focus of this today, I wanted to highlight that one because I think it could be pretty helpful as we think about the regulatory approaches to generative AI-enabled devices. So taking that example and kind of zooming out a little bit, I did just want to remind folks that we consider intended use and technological characteristics within our broader risk-based regulatory framework. So when thinking about generative AI, there are technological characteristics of generative AI that may sometimes introduce new or different risks for a particular generative AI-enabled product. which raises, in turn, new questions of safety and effectiveness. So what that means is that a de novo may be necessary to regulate that product. And through that de novo process, the output is that FDA would then establish a new device type, new regulation, and that would be accompanied by special controls as appropriate for that new device type. So FDA may require special controls that are unique to generative AI-enabled devices when needed to provide that reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of the device. Such special controls could include requirements for post-market monitoring, such as the need for a performance monitoring plan. Again, this is why I mentioned that example. Just to give you an example, it could be a performance monitoring plan like that one, but obviously there's an open question around what would, a good or appropriate performance monitoring plan look like for a generative AI-enabled device. And that is where I think some of your input later today would be helpful. All right, so shifting gears, I want to talk about predetermined change control plans for devices. So this, again, is another mechanism that I think could be particularly useful as we think about regulatory approaches for these technologies. So by way of background, Section 515C was added to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 2022, and this really clarified FDA's authority to authorize devices with PCCPs, which include planned changes to devices that would otherwise require submission. So maybe said a little differently, this is a least burdensome mechanism for both FDA and industry to allow a company to pre-specify how they intend for their device to change, and FDA review that and authorize that such that then they wouldn't have to come back to us to make those changes. They'd be able to proceed with those modifications. So the scope, this is not in any way limited to software or AI/ML. It is broadly applicable to all medical devices, and it is in effect right now. It is self-executing, which means that today manufacturers may submit and FDA may approve or clear a PCCP for a device at this time. And we've been doing just that. We've authorized PCCPs for devices across the spectrum in 510K, de novo, and PMA. So we do have a draft guidance that we issued focused on providing recommendations for PCCPs for AI/ML-enabled devices. This guidance really outlines our science-based approach to putting safe and effective advancements in the hands of users and healthcare providers faster. Again, our goal here is to help increase the pace of medical device innovation, and our approach, as outlined, has been informed heavily by our experience in regulating AI/ML-enabled devices to date. So briefly, just want to go through the components of a PCCP, and these are described in detail in the draft guidance. So first we have the description of the modifications, then we have the modification protocol, and then finally we have the impact assessment. So together, all three of those are what we call a PCCP. So first we have the description of the modifications, which is exactly how it sounds. This is where a manufacturer would provide a detailed description of each of the planned modifications that they intend to make to their device. So this includes very specific modifications that can be verified and validated, and that those modifications are provided at a level of detail that actually allows FDA to do our assessment so that we can reach our conclusion on that device that it's going to be safe and effective with those changes. And the guidance talks about how we recommend that manufacturers specify whether those planned modifications would be implemented manually or automatically. We also recommend that manufacturers specify if proposed modifications would be implemented globally or locally. So when thinking about the modifications that are appropriate for inclusion in a PCCP, these are those modifications that are really intended to maintain or improve safety or effectiveness of the device. They are specific, they are able to be verified and validated, and in accordance with 515C, they must maintain the device within its intended use. All right, so now that we understand the changes that are being proposed, what we would also see is the modification protocol. So this is where a manufacturer describes their methods that would be followed when developing, validating, and implementing the modifications outlined in the PCCP. So this includes the verification and validation activities. It includes predefined acceptance criteria, And this is what would support that those modifications can be made to ensure that the device remains safe and effective. And the methods that are described within that protocol should be consistent with and support those modifications. It's also really helpful when manufacturers describe for us how those methods may be similar to or different from methods that are used elsewhere in that submission, or maybe a previous submission for a different version of the device. So in the draft guidance, we go into some detail around components of the modification protocol, again, specific to AI-enabled devices. So we focus on the importance of a manufacturer describing to us their data management practices. For example, how are they going to assure quality, adequate quality of the data? How are they going to determine a reference standard? For retraining, what are their objectives and how will they implement that retraining? For performance evaluation, we're looking for assessment metrics. We are looking for statistical analysis plans, as well as performance targets. And then for update procedures, and again, I know this has been a common theme today, it's really important that we understand how and when updates will be implemented and how users will know that those updates have happened, because transparency, again, is incredibly important here. And then also device monitoring plan could be a part of update procedures. And then the final component of a PCCP is the impact assessment. This is where a manufacturer documents essentially their benefit risk assessment for the PCCP, such that FDA at the end of this review can determine that the risks have been adequately identified and mitigated, such that the modifications within the PCCP could be made and the device would remain safe and effective. We do also recommend that labeling be updated in accordance with the PCCP, again, to make users aware of the modifications that have been implemented via that PCCP. This includes providing a description of the implemented modifications that would include a summary of the current device performance, a description of how modifications were implemented, as well as a description of how users will be informed of the implemented modifications. And as you may be aware, many of our FDA-authorized devices include public decision summaries. So we do recommend that the public-facing documentation include a summary of some of the key PCCP information, again, to support transparency and safe and effective use of the device. All right, so we've made it through our crash course on PCCPs. So I did want to leave you with some considerations as we think about how we can leverage PCCPs for adaptive algorithms. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, so please don't take it that way. But really just a few thoughts that are top of mind as we think about how we might leverage PCCPs here. So you heard me say a couple of times, the importance of having specificity when it comes to how exactly the device will change related to the modifications. So I think we have to think about and appropriately calibrate, how specific can the modifications be for an adaptive algorithm in a PCCP? Would that look different when thinking about a locked algorithm, for example? What boundaries or guardrails could be established in the PCCP to better define the range of automatic updates, for example? How are we going to think about post-market performance being monitored over time to assure the device's performance is maintained or improved? And how do we make sure we account for monitoring across multiple sites, allowing for local and site-specific adaptations? How will labeling, again, be updated when modifications are implemented automatically to inform users? We want users to have the right access to the right information at the right time. Appropriate notification requirements could be considered here. This is, again, tying back to 515C, where notification requirements would be needed if the device does not function as intended pursuant with the PCCP. So again, with that, I will wrap up, but I just want you to keep in mind as you all are thinking today and you're faced with FDA's questions, these are a couple of regulatory approaches that could be helpful as we think about how best to regulate these types of technologies. So with that, I will thank you for your time.
Presentation now.
Hello, colleagues on the FDA Digital Health Advisory Committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually today, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some thoughts around regulatory oversight and the total product lifecycle for generative AI devices and algorithms. My name is Chris Longhurst, and I serve as the Chief Clinical and Innovation Officer at UC San Diego Health, as well as the Executive Director for the Jacob Center for Health Innovation at UC San Diego. And I want to share with you off the bat 3 key ideas. First of all, I think the FDA should reconsider the 510K pathway for AI algorithms and should be empowered with the increased authority to require transparent outcomes data about products. Number 2, I think that you should have increased authority for post-marketing surveillance. And then number 3, I really think this is a shared responsibility of health delivery organizations. And I think we as hospitals and health systems should be subject to a regulatory requirement for local testing and monitoring that can help you with that post-marketing surveillance. So I'd like to share 3 quick case studies and examples of how this might work. I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about AI and patient safety, particularly since we're celebrating the 25-year anniversary of the Institute of Medicine report to err is human, and yet we know we haven't made the progress we wanted to make in the last 25 years. So recently, I identified a dozen different areas in which AI can help us with patient safety. So the first case study I'll share is about chest x-rays. At UC San Diego Health, the pandemic started about a month early because we got a plane full of expatriates from Wuhan here at the Miramar Air Force Base. And by the time that end of March rolled around, we actually had deployed an AI algorithm to help with detection of COVID pneumonia. We had some anecdotal data that this was helping, but we undertook a rigorous study to really identify whether it was achieving impactful outcomes. And what we found was that over the course of the summer of 2020, that 1 in 5 patients who got a chest x-ray had a different clinical decision because of the AI. This is a really remarkable outcome. And in most cases, what it was about was deciding whether or not to test. So you can imagine that as testing became ubiquitous in the fall of 2020, that this algorithm actually became less useful. And in fact, concomitant with the AI Bill of Rights that the president later published, that AI should be monitored for outcomes on an ongoing basis rather than a single offsite evaluation, we actually chose to discontinue this AI-based alert by the end of 2020. So that's one important learning. The second was that a couple of years later, this article was cited in a review article about AI and COVID. Turns out there were over 9,000 articles published on this topic in 24 months, and this group found just 4 that had clinical outcomes. You can imagine my surprise when one of the 2 from the United States was the one I just shared with you. So this really identifies and highlights a big issue, which is the health AI paradox. There are many, many, many algorithms being proposed and published, but very, very few that have actually been evaluated for the impact on clinical outcomes. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And the second example is around sepsis. I don't have to tell this audience that it's the dangerous condition that affects 1.7 million adults on an annual basis, and 1/3 Americans die on an annual basis. So it's something we've been tackling locally at UC San Diego Health with both traditional methods and novel AI algorithms. And credit to Dr. Gabe Wardy and Shamim Namadi, pictured here, who published earlier this year that their deep learning sepsis prediction model actually had a significant impact on mortality. In fact, the 17% is a combination of our 2 emergency departments, and the one in Hillcrest, which serves a more underserved population, actually had a bigger impact on mortality. So not only are we having meaningful clinical outcomes, we're actually closing health disparities with this AI algorithm as well. And this paper was highlighted by the editor of the journal, who wrote an editorial really highlighting the importance of these type of meaningful outcome metrics, and suggests that funding agencies and journals alike should be shifting to prioritize these type of studies. Now, in contrast, there was a first ever FDA clearance of a sepsis AI algorithm just a few months back that was based off of the 513F2 process, de novo process. And going through the 50 pages of data that's publicly available for it, what you find is that it's a retrospective analysis of data with no meaningful clinical outcomes. And so I hope that this works, but we don't really know. In fact, it's kind of like approving a drug and saying that this new breast cancer drug has very few side effects, but we don't have any idea about its efficacy. In fact, some of my colleagues here at UC San Diego recently proposed a regulatory strategy for AI that's outcome-centric and would require companies to demonstrate AI tools produce clinically important differences in patient outcomes before being brought to market. So that takes us to the third and final case study, which is something that came up just earlier this year when we started tackling generative AI in the electronic health record. Now, our AI principles at UC San Diego are listed on the left. I shared this story with the White House Task Force last fall, and it was encompassed in the statement that was released in December. So we were one of the first 2 health systems in the country to implement generative AI in electronic health record to help respond to patient messages. And one of the principles we adhered to was accountability. So none of these messages go out without being reviewed by a human, which is why there's only 2 buttons, to start with a draft or start with the blank reply. There's no button that says just send now. But the second principle we talked about was transparency. And the question was asked whether we should be transparent with the patients that we serve. And some of our doctors even argued, we use dot phrases and macros today, but we don't have an addendum suggesting that. But our patient representatives really highlighted that AI can be scary for patients. And so anytime one of our clinicians uses that start with draft button, an addendum is automatically appended that transparently shares with patients that part of the message was generated automatically before being reviewed and edited by their doctor. This actually came up recently in a New York Times article where you see Teddy Rosenblatt's subheadline saying, many patients have no clue that replies are software generated. In fact, in California, one of our lawmakers, Lisa Calderon, recently proposed a bill that was signed by our governor into law, Assembly Bill 3030, that's going to require disclosure to patients and families when AI is used to generate communications, whether they're written or telephonic. So where do we go from here? Well, again, number one, I think what really matters is outcomes. And we recently called, along with Anish Chopra, the former White House CTO, and others, for a network of AI implementation science centers. What we don't need is assurance labs looking at algorithm performance, because the real-world impact on outcomes can't be predicted from performance. Just like in that case of sepsis, where we actually sacrificed accuracy of the algorithm in order to put it earlier in the workflow where it could have more impact for our clinicians' decision-making. The second thing is we can't let the hospitals and health systems off the hook. This is a shared responsibility. And so we called, along with Raj Watwani and other co-authors, for CMS conditions of participation to require AI oversight when deployed in health systems. So again, to recap, I think Dr. Bob Califf agrees with this concept that health systems have to step up on AI regulation, and healthcare delivery organizations should be held accountable. Along with that, we think the FDA should reconsider the 510K pathway for algorithms and should have increased authority to require transparent outcomes data and increased authority for post-marketing surveillance. So again, thank you for your time and look forward to the vigorous conversation. Take care.
Wonderful to have Dr. Longhurst join us, albeit virtually. Next, we will hear a stakeholder perspective from Dr. Nina Kotler. Dr. Nina Kotler is the Associate Chief Medical Officer for Clinical Artificial Intelligence at Radiology Partners. Dr. Kotler, you may begin.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm enjoying this robust discussion, sitting here watching both days and trying not to chime in yet until it's my turn. But I am noticing that from the clinical stakeholders, the people that are using this tool, which is mostly in radiology, but also in other arenas, we seem to be saying a similar message, and I'm going to be echoing that message today. So I'm going to talk to you today about post-market performance monitoring in radiology, because that's where we've started and that's where we've been doing it. And just to give you a little background, I am the Associate Chief Medical Officer within Radiology Partners. Radiology Partners is the largest radiology practice in the US. We are on site in 35 states, and we have a sister practice that is a teleradiology practice that performs evaluations remotely in all 50 states. We have a very massive and variable footprint, from very rural sites to level 1 trauma centers in urban environments, to academic groups where we teach residents about radiology, and everything in between. So the variability in what we see is quite massive, and it's been very instructive to us. We also have a very big footprint in terms of scale. We do 10% of all of the imaging that is done in the United States is interpreted at our practice. And we've been using artificial intelligence since 2016. So we have a massive amount of deployment experience. In fact, when I I looked back, this was data from May, when I looked back at how many exams or reports have we processed, either through computer vision or a language model, it was 200 million, and that was back in May. So now, when I look at that process, which is accelerated, just by the end of this year, we'll have processed 100 million exams through some kind of artificial intelligence system or reports. So it's that experience that I hope to bring to you today. So here are my disclosures. So the first question is, how is artificial intelligence, really the new generative AI, because that's what you guys are asking about, being used in radiology today? And there's 4 ways that I'm seeing. Vast majority is having an output of some kind of text. So it's usually a textual output. Either it's text input and text output, or it's text and or a computer vision, like a imaging input to get a text output. We do have some imaging outputs. That's not nearly as common. It's going to get more and more common. And I'm not going to talk about that specifically today. However, I think a lot of the principles that I'm going to speak about will apply. All right, I will mention that continuous validation in artificial intelligence, whether it is the new generative AI models or the old-fashioned models, is something that is evolving. There isn't a best practice out there that everyone is using, but there is a lot of good theory, and we're going to be hearing and seeing a lot more and more of that over the year. So today we're going to talk about 2 things. I'm going to start with a monitoring that we have done on a GenAI system that's used across 40% of the radiology practices that are out there. And so it's significantly in clinical use. We wanted to take a look at how accurate that was in clinical, in the clinical environment. And then the second thing we'll talk about is, you asked, what could be a framework for how we do this continuous monitoring with generative AI in the future. So we'll go through that second. The reason why I want to talk about this first section is because I want us to be a little more precise about our language. All right, so this is a radiology report. Radiology report has an initial section that I'm calling the preamble. It has details about the patient and the reason for the exam, the type of exam that was done. And then the radiologist will dictate something in the findings section. That's what are we visualizing in this image? We articulate that in the findings section. And then the impression is exactly that. It's our impression of the things that we saw and what that means for that patient. And as the consultant for the other physicians, that's what the radiologist's job is the physician's physician. That impression section is, how do we think that you guys should think about how can we help you as the referring clinician take care of your patient better? So we have a generative AI system. Again, it's being used quite significantly throughout the radiology practices all across the US. And that generative AI system will take the findings that the radiologist dictates, and when they get into that section of the report, it will automatically populate that for the radiologist. Now, we don't send this off. This is not something that is under FDA guidance, but we still don't send it off. It's not necessarily something that we think is safe to send off. We have a radiologist right there in charge of the radiology report. They take a look at that impression. They read through that, and they may change it. They may edit a part of it, they may edit all of it, or they may edit none of it. So what we did is we wanted to compare what was the generative AI output to what the final edited report or non-edited report was. So we looked at 3,000 radiology reports from across our very highly variable practice, and we compared those 2 together. Now, when we compared it, we didn't just compare it with a large language model and expect that the radiology report was accurate. There are people here that have mentioned a few times, everyone says different things. So we had a panel of experts, of radiologists that reviewed these, and we wanted to validate the accuracy, but we also wanted to determine if the changes that were made were clinically significant. And I'll go straight to the results of those. The results is that the AI, the generative AI, had a 4.8% clinically significant error rate in generating the impressions. That's 1 out of every 21 reports would have had something that was clinically significant, meaning would have affected the patient. Now, what's super interesting about it is we looked at the final result. Now, the final result actually only had a 1% error rate. And why is that? We decreased the error rate significantly because we had the radiologists, which are the experts. We had them in the loop evaluating the AI. So it's not just a human in the loop, which I absolutely agree with. It's a specific human in the loop. It's an expert human in the loop. So we had an expert human in the loop. The 1% error rate is significantly decreased from the 4.8%, but that doesn't tell the whole story. The actual error rate that was decreased, it decreased to 0.5% by the radiologist. So you're saying, well, Nina, you're telling me that it was 0.5, but here you have that it was a 1% error rate. And that's because when the radiologist redictated that change, because they're not generally typing it, they're dictating, they introduced another 0.5% error. So the actual decrease in error rate went from 4.8% to 0.5% with an expert human in the loop. That's a 90% improvement in error. And this is something that we found, whether it is in pre-validation before we deploy an AI or in this kind of monitoring after an AI is deployed, that there's significant mitigation of the errors that the AI makes at the point of care, especially when it is an expert in the loop, and especially when you educate those experts about the types of errors that you tend to find. It's very hard to go to a radiologist and say, just be careful on every single exam because 5% of the time it's going to make a mistake. How do you find that 5 out of 100 cases? I mean, it's like finding a needle in the haystack. The goal is you either make the haystack smaller or the needle bigger. And the way you do that is you try to understand the types of errors that the AI is making. And this is what I think is the most important part for us, whether it's the FDA or the market, to do in advance of deploying these models, is understand where it's making those errors so that we can educate our end user. Right, so a lot of times we are very generic in our language, and when we talk about the error types made by generative AI, we call them all hallucinations or confabulations. But that is not specific enough to bring as education to the physicians for them to understand where the errors are going to be made. And so I broke them down a little bit more for you, and I'm going to go through examples. So numerosity errors, laterality or body site, recommendation, misfindings, other hallucinations. Let's go through them one by one, and I'm going to show you exactly where we found those errors and what they looked like. Now, this is important because if we use the right language, language helps us with safety. You first have to have the language, the ontology to describe it, just like we do for CT and MR artifacts. We see them all the time, but we still deploy CTs and MRs even though they have artifacts, but we have a language for them. We educate our physicians about what they are so that they can mitigate and understand them at the point of care. So let's start at the top with numerosity errors. Those are errors of number. And every time I show you these images, it's going to first show you the findings section so you can see what the AI was using to make its decision. Then I'll show you the generative AI impression. That's the summarized impression from that findings. And then last, I'll show you the final impression, which is the edited impression by the expert in the loop. And you can see in this case that there's a lot of numbers that were dictated. Now, this is a very small part of a CTA examination where lots of numbers are dictated. I just took a segment of this. This is not the full report. And you can see that there's 3 numbers that were dictated, 70%, 30%, 40%, and they were all about a stenosis of a different vessel. The generative AI was confused with those numbers and didn't bring them precisely into the impression. In fact, it said 70-40-40 instead of 70-30-40. And that is clinically significant. Now, it could have said 30, it could have said 300, it could have said something else. And this is the thing that we have to be careful about. So how do you make sure that your radiologists are seeing this? Well, they have to know that more often the AI is going to generate errors when it comes to numbers. And here you can see they corrected it. Here's another numerosity example, and this is one that we see commonly, that dates, when they're dictated separately, often get combined together. That has a clinically significant output when you're looking at something longitudinally. So here it took the 10 and the 25 from the first date and combined it with the year 2019 of the second date. The radiologist expert in the loop corrected it in the final impression. Let's go on to the next one, which is laterality. Now, laterality is one form of this error that we're calling a fill-in-the-blank error. Now, why do we call it fill-in-the-blank error? It's something that I think we can understand as clinicians. It means that if you're not dictating something that is normally dictated, the AI is just going to guess and fill in that blank that you left. So in this example, the initial findings is talking about the femur. Now, we have two femurs. There's a left femur and a right. You don't just say the leg has this finding. You say the left leg or the right leg. Now, the exam is usually of one leg, but generally we dictate this. So the GenAI didn't know what leg it was, but it's used to having a laterality associated when you say femur, and so it guessed. Now, it guessed wrong in this case. It allowed the radiologist found that, allowed them to change it. Actually, also allowed them to find that error in the findings and fix the error in the findings. This is also a benefit of the AI, what we call a mirror effect, is it mirrors the errors that are in your findings, brings them down to your impression, and actually 1.7% of the time, the radiologist is able to find errors in their findings because of this, right? And that's higher than the 1% error rate overall that this is brought down to. Okay, it's not just with laterality. This fill-in-the-blank error happens to anything that we're saying consistently, so body site, stability of something over time, severity, size, and the clinical indication. So we're seeing this quite frequently. The next one is recommendation. Now, we've actually turned off the recommendation function of this GenAI. It has a separate function that will look at population health guidelines and provide that population health guidelines. We've turned that off because we have another tool that does it. But there's still recommendations built in the embedding space because there's recommendation in the radiology reports. And sometimes it will pull in recommendations that aren't appropriate. So we tell all of our radiologists, anytime you see a recommendation, you have to be more vigilant because it may be making an error. And in this case, it's recommending an MRI for a benign finding. It even says non-aggressive. And the final impression, the radiologist was able to change that, saying this is favored to represent something that is benign and doesn't require this MRI follow-up. Missed finding, there are times where the AI does not bring the relevant finding down into the impression section. Maybe it's not built in the embedding space and seen it enough, and in this case, it does make a difference. So this was clinically significant. This is a urologic examination where there was distension of the kidneys, and usually that's related to some kind of obstruction, and you're looking for the obstruction. They didn't find an obstruction, but what they did see is that the bladder is really distended, and that can be a cause of hydronephrosis. The impression brought by the AI did not mention the bladder distension, which is very relevant in this case. The radiologist added it, so a missed finding. And then other hallucinations I'm going to break down a little bit more for you. So this one we call the nearest neighbor, and this is related to the embedding space. What kind of things commonly are said together in your radiology reports for which the embedding space has associated those? So in this case, it's the initial findings, small amount of free fluid in the pelvis. One of the most common things, especially in women, the cause of this is just ovarian cyst rupture. We see it all the time. And so the GenAI associated those things together. Unfortunately, this is a male patient, so not quite appropriate, but the radiologist was able to change that, and that is something that we call a nearest neighbor effect. Here's another kind of hallucination where it's contradicting itself. So in this case, there was a contrast enema that was done to look for a connection between the rectum and the vagina. And they said they did that, but they didn't find this fistula. But the GenAI impression highlighted at the bottom, it said, well, they didn't do a contrast enema. Well, we actually did. That's how you figured out the results. So the radiologist removed that. That's a contradiction to the initial statement. Another case is one of redundancy, and in this examination, we find this frequently. Like you're dictating a CT scan of the chest, there's often more than one lung nodule. And we'll mention a bunch of them. Maybe not all of them. We'll say there's a whole bunch, and here's at least the top 5, but there'll be multiple. And you can see there's a 4 millimeter and a 6 millimeter nodule in this case. It mentioned both of those in the first impression, great first impression, but then it re-mentioned the 6 millimeter nodule again, and that can be quite confusing. We don't want to be overly treating and mentioning things twice so that we think of them as separate nodules when in fact they're not, so the radiologist fixed this. All right, so hopefully you got an idea from our actual validation of using this in production with radiologists overseeing it, a few things. Number one, a better language, a more specific language that we can use to understand how to describe these findings, because you need the language in order to educate, and you need education to mitigate at the point of care, which absolutely can happen. Now let's talk about a framework for continuous monitoring. How could we potentially do this at scale? Now this is something that Keith mentioned and a lot of other people have talked about. The way we're doing this now is we have our data, whether that is imaging data or a document, that goes into an AI system. The AI system does the evaluation and you get your AI results. We are then in radiology, most of it is being done for a radiology report, so we're comparing it against the radiology report, and you're looking for concordance or discordance between those results. Now, you can either do that at scale with no clinical adjudication. You could do it the way we did, where we adjudicated every case. You have to probably do something in between, because adjudicating every case, you just don't have enough RADs to go around. But it is an important component to make sure you have that expert group that is looking to validate, to make sure that there isn't automation bias and other things that you don't find automatically. But those are the first two ways that you could evaluate the performance of a generative AI at scale. One, automated on its own. Two, with some component of a human in the loop. Now, that's not the only way. There's a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth way. So I'm going to show you the third one. The third one is called ensembling. And what you do in that case is you create multiple AI models that are doing the same kind of task as your initial AI model. They can be much smaller, they can be much cheaper, they don't need to necessarily go through FDA clearance. All you're using them is for a quality assurance check. And you look to see if the output of this group of AI models, if one of them or two of them are different from the AI that you're looking at, then you could adjudicate those cases. And that's a way to see something before the radiologist actually gets the result. Another way to look at your AI results continuously before the radiologist gets the result is look at the data input. We all know that if the training data was not sufficient, then you're not necessarily going to get a great result. In this case, you could look to see, is your data that you are using for that case in or out of distribution from your training data? I will say it is far more effective doing it this way than it is for me at the point of care to have a nutrition label about what was seen, the training information done by the AI, because I'm not going to be able to use that at the point of care. But I can use this at the point of care, where if something is looking and telling me this is out of distribution from the training data, that helps me at the point of care be more vigilant. All right, so here are those 4 plus 2 more, which people have mentioned. There's also model stress testing that you can do. And of course, user feedback. User feedback is essential. It's just you're not going to get it from everyone, so it will be a little bit biased. Now, each one of those will have strengths and weaknesses. And the point here is that there is no one way that you all have to do this. There's multiple ways that we could do this. And depending on the risk of the device and who is using that, if it's an expert or a non-expert, all of these things can be combined using either one of them or multiple of them, depending on the model that you're evaluating and the model risk. So today we talked a little bit about how generative AI is being used in healthcare. It should be monitored. It absolutely can be monitored. And that will provide us far better information than we're getting now pre-validation. What I do think we should be doing pre-validation is understanding the types of errors that are made. That's the risk, and using that to educate the radiologist or the end user at the point of care. Our validation on this GenAI model suggests that it should not be autonomous. It can be used on it shouldn't be used on its own. It should be used with an expert in the loop, but that is definitely useful, and the expert should be educated on the types of errors that are made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kotler. Next, we have Dr. Grace Cordovano. She's a board-certified patient advocate, founder of Enlightening Results, and co-founder of Unblock Health. Dr. Cordovano, you may proceed.
It's an absolute honor to have the opportunity to share the patient and care partner perspective now on post-market performance monitoring of GenAI-enabled medical devices. As a board-certified patient advocate, my day-to-day is working with patients and families from point of diagnosis through survivorship or end-of-life care planning. Many of my patients rely heavily on different types of modalities of imaging as well as pathology, have numerous specialists in the mix, and often are faced with making very difficult, life-altering, life-limiting decisions in sometimes less than 60 seconds. access to credible information is key. In addition to my professional advocacy, I'm the primary care partner of 2 disabled adults, and I'm a patient myself. This topic deeply resonates with me, and it matters a lot. So as I dreamed big about what comments I could prepare today to prepare something and a conversation that would shape and set the table, I wanted to start with some statistics from a recent community-based survey that was published in September, conducted by the Light Collective. They had a community-based survey of 377 participants who self-identified as diverse patients, care partners, and advocates. And some highlights from this survey. 91% of respondents stated that they are concerned and want to be informed if AI is being used to make decisions about their care or if it's being used about communications of their care. 74% of patients and caregivers and advocates that responded stated that they are moderately or extremely concerned about potential unauthorized disclosures of their information. Privacy matters. 97% of respondents stated that they were at least somewhat concerned about potential negative impacts of AI and harms that could happen with AI being applied to their care. When we hear stats like this, of course, we clearly need to get post-market monitoring right as soon as possible. So dream big with me as I look at a different approach, a patient-centric approach to post-market performance monitoring. And as I thought about that, 4 arenas really crystallized for me. The first one being partnership and co-creation with patients. This meeting was divided in pre- and post-market considerations. But the reality is, from the patient perspective, robust post-market performance monitoring will require intentional partnership with diverse populations, diverse patient voices included throughout the process in a co-creation process that goes throughout the entire product life cycle. If I had to summarize, I would say patient communities feel very strongly that oversight of AI has to be democratic, and there have to be checks and balances on power. From the patient perspective, while safety evaluation of AI, of course, needs to be deployed and evaluation of AI needs to be implemented by industry, from the patient perspective, industry can't be the only one driving the bus and the only one in charge. The patient stakeholder perspective matters and needs to be included continuously and throughout. We've heard a lot about outputs. Let's talk a little bit more about outputs. When an output is generated by one of these AI-powered medical devices, patients don't see them. I loved the presentation right before me, which dove into some of the intricacies of the outputs. But the reality is if an output that's generated is used to make decisions about an individual's care or coordination of care, a patient should have access to it. It should be recognized as part of the designated record set. It should be part of our medical record. This is essential for trust and transparency's sake. These outputs are going to require standards for exchange if they become part of our medical record. These outputs matter for informed decision-making and shared decision-making. And I'll share a personal story. I have a family history of breast cancer. I've been receiving mammograms for the last 14 years. And I was excited when my last mammogram came in and I saw that it was mentioned that there was an enhanced breast cancer detection software applied to my mammogram. The mammogram was normal. However, there was a number of benign findings. So here for 13 years, nothing. Now I've got Anyone who knows how I operate, I immediately called the imaging center and I asked for a copy of the output. I wanted details. Where were these findings coming from? Could these be false positives? I wanted more details. What did my other mammogram images look like? Could that AI be applied to those? And are there trends? Well, needless to say, they didn't know what to do with me. I got a ma'am, we don't do that. I asked if I could have a copy of my mammogram without the AI applied so I could do a side-by-side comparison. They escalated me to a manager, to a supervisor. We can't accept a ma'am, we don't do that, because that is patient engagement. And it mattered to me because I'm at a higher risk for breast cancer. So even though I was told everything was benign, A month later, I got a confusing letter saying, based on your mammogram, you now need to go for an MRI. So there's just discrepancies. And I care and I'm digging in, and I know that there's other patients and families that are digging in as well. So now we're going to do co-creation, we're going to partner with patients, we're going to look into getting access to these outputs that are so meaningful and filled with rich information. Now patients really need transparency on where GenAI is being used in our care. You know, I outlined my comments for today and I started to get frustrated because how can patients, I think it's wonderful that the patient voice is being included, but we're at a complete disadvantage here. We have no idea where it's being applied in our care. We don't know at what point, who's doing it, and I actually have a list of questions that started to come through because I posted that I was presenting today. So bear with me. Patient communities want to know about GenAI-enabled devices GenAI-enabled medical devices. Who is, when, and where are these devices being used? How effective are these devices where they are being used? What training data was being used? What are the outcomes? What should be celebrated? Where is potential bias, discrimination, and harm happening? Is this pinpointed anywhere? I want to avoid these places of care, period, the end. When are outputs not used and ignored? Did the doctor override it? How is that documented? What if that override was wrong? What are some GenAI-enabled medical devices? Are some better than others in safeguarding my patient information? What if an output leads to something discriminatory and harm happens? As you can see, this is just a sampling of high-level questions that patient communities are asking, and it really highlights the need for patients to be included, and I'll plug my 2 cents in. Sounds like a great opportunity for a patient task force or work group. Number 4, patient as human in the loop. We've heard a lot about human in the loop, but we don't recognize the patient as an active participant. Troy, I loved your comments about calling out the shortages that we're going to have in a few years, and I'm going to channel one of my mentors, Dave DeBronkart, ePatient Dave, who says, let patients help. So we talk about having humans in the loop with respect to safe and responsible use of gen-enabled medical devices. Number 1, patients must be recognized as end users of GenAI-enabled medical devices. Number 2, we must be recognized as essential humans in the loop, locally, regionally, and nationally, and have the opportunity to provide structured feedback somewhere when it's applied to our care. So we're warned about hallucinations. Don't use it. Don't use it. It's all these things, the fear-mongering. But what do we do if we do use it and we find something wrong? We have nowhere to go. I'll close with another example. Not only have we not been offered a mitigation strategy, we don't even have a collaborative strategic approach either. When I attend appointments with patients, let's say I'm in the emergency room and I have a patient that's been there for 36 hours waiting for a bed. I can go and complain to a social worker who can then maybe escalate me to the charge nurse, who can then get me to the Office of Patient Experience, and we can move things along and escalate if there's an insurance issue. If I have a problem getting a copy of my medical records, I can go to the Office of Health Information Management. I can escalate to the privacy officer. If that doesn't work, I can file an information blocking complaint. If I have a problem with a GenAI-enabled tool or any type of tool that's part of my care, my loved one's care, or any of the patients I serve, who do I go to, boots on the ground? There's no point person. So yes, there's going to also need to be, when we think about post-market monitoring, how can patients and families and advocates help and have either a person locally, or maybe it's nationally, maybe it's a separate office as we think big about strategies. That's sort of my closing remarks to leave with you today, and those are the 4 categories that I see necessary for building an infrastructure of patient-centric post-market performance monitoring. Thank you so much.
Dr. Cordovano, thank you so much. Our last presenter of the morning is Dale Webster, who is the Director of Health AI Research at Google. Dr. Webster. Oh, Dr. Webster is on the video.
My name is Dale Webster. I'm a Research Director at Google, focused on health and AI. And I'll be talking to you today a little bit about our experience so far with generative AI and post-market monitoring and other model evaluation methods. We'll start out talking a bit about generative AI and maybe how it differs from previous versions of AI that we're more familiar with, like predictive AI. Then I'll go a little bit into the AI lifecycle, how we think about it, how it's similar and different. And then finally, I'll deep dive into model evaluation, which I think is where the really interesting parts of the differences between the two come into play. So first, a little bit about generative AI. So in order to understand it, let's go back to, say, 2016 or so, when AI was first sort of becoming more visible in the public eye. The technology had reached a point where suddenly it could do things that we hadn't really imagined it would be able to do anytime soon. Things like tell the difference between a cat and a dog from a photo, or maybe even the difference between specific species of cats and dogs in ways that most humans couldn't do. It was definitely a very interesting time. It got a lot of people interested in the space, and the method of choice then was convolutional neural networks. Around this time, we saw a lot of additional research, including our group, into what this might mean for healthcare. And so naturally, the first areas we looked were in medical imaging, and we used sort of the same kinds of models that consumers were using to search for cats and dogs in their photos, to start looking at things like, can you diagnose diabetic retinopathy or DME from a fundus photo, many other kinds of imaging analysis of this sort. And that process, so that was almost a decade ago now. And I think over the last 8 or 9 years, we've learned a lot about that space. We understand it pretty well. We understand how these models work, how we measure them, things like this. And we're starting to see traction in actually getting them into patient care, which is great. Of course, fast forward to about 2 years ago, and suddenly large language models, which are this kind of newer kind of AI, hit sort of that similar level of readiness that we saw with convolutional neural networks in 2016. And suddenly became very interesting, and people started to think about how to incorporate these into products and into the world. And so a little bit about how generative AI is different, large language models in particular. Instead of starting with a photo, set of pixels, or a sort of piece of constrained sized data, instead they start with text, so a series of words and letters. Those are fed into a model. It goes through typically a transformer architecture, which is kind of the equivalent of a CNN convolutional network, but quite a bit different. And from this transformer, the model tries to predict what the next correct word is. You can kind of think of it, at some level, as a very fancy autocomplete. And so this is a fundamentally different kind of model. The underlying math at the basic level is similar, but the architecture is quite different. The inputs and the outputs are different. And we'll talk a little bit about the properties of different and what that means for its use. So that was about a year or two ago where we first started to see it move into the product direction. And the last 2 years, we've kind of been watching this develop. And what we're seeing is kind of this rapidly evolving system of new models being trained and measured every day, new model architecture ideas still under exploration. And there's a lot of sort of engineering and work going on to try to get better at these trade-offs that we're seeing with the models around cost, speed, and generalizability. In general, people are trying to sort of drive down costs, increase speed, increase generalizability so we can make these more useful for products. So it's a very rapidly evolving space. And this is similar to convolutional networks in 2017, 2018. They went through sort of a similar process. And so I think we can kind of expect to see the same pattern where something like 8 or 10 years, we'll watch this evolve and we'll understand these things much better. So that's kind of on the technical side. But let's think about, okay, when these models hit the real world, what does that mean? What's an AI lifecycle for generative AI look like? And this is a great diagram pulled from the FDA around the AI lifecycle. And looking at this, really the diagram doesn't change all that much. These are still the same steps we use in generative AI that we use in more traditional AI approaches. The details, I think, within each of these steps will be different. And in some of these steps, it's not that different. In others, it's quite a bit different. For the rest of the talk, I want to focus on 2 of these areas. Real-world performance evaluation and verification and validation. These are the areas that I think have the most important differences, and the differences that we should spend a lot of time figuring out in the next couple of years. And you'll notice that the common theme for these is they're both the parts of a life cycle where you're doing model evaluation. And so, one of the ways we do evaluation is post-market monitoring. It's definitely something I want to touch on specifically in this talk. This is a diagram we use for our post-market monitoring to describe our post-market monitoring for our imaging systems, where we have areas where the models are deployed. At each of these areas, we're randomly sampling images and the grades that the model is giving for these images. We're sending them back to a central point where we have humans and other automated methods looking at these grades, evaluating whether they're correct or not. And then we have sort of dashboards and experimentation we can run to assess when maybe something's changing out in the world that we need to update our model to compensate for, and things like that. And really this level, post-market monitoring, I kind of expect to be the same for generative AI. That basic process is quite similar. But once again, it's this evaluation part at the end that's going to be tricky. So we'll deep dive into that for a bit here. Going back to images, evaluation for images is comparatively straightforward. So images, typically we use an image as an input, and then we use some sort of smallish number of classification outputs, even a larger number, maybe even up to thousands of potential outputs for classification, but it's usually a discrete list. And this could be things like, does this image show evidence of a disease? Could be, what level of severity of this disease does this image show? And the nice part about sort of a small discrete number of outputs is there's pretty well worked out metrics and statistics for measuring performance based on those. We can take a bunch of images, we can look at the outputs, we can compare those to some sort of ground truth like expert raters, and we can measure things like sensitivity, specificity, basic accuracy. The more complex versions are disease severity, where maybe the difference between two options, we sort of want to penalize more the difference between high severity and low severity versus two grades in the middle. There's still pretty nice techniques for doing that, things like kappa scores. But if we look at a generative AI model, this is an example of kind of an input and an output for that. The input here is a question: how do humans get toxoplasmosis? And the output is about a 100-word description of what that might be. How do you tell whether this is right or wrong? Is this a correct answer or an incorrect answer? And like, to what degree is it correct or incorrect? You can sort of immediately see this is a very different problem to try and tackle. And so there aren't well worked out methods here. There's no sort of simple, widely accepted things we can look at. And so a bunch of groups have been looking at, okay, what are these? Can we build custom multi-dimensional frameworks for how we think about what makes an answer right or wrong? These are examples from a paper from ours from last year, where we looked at kind of a battery of clinician evaluation frameworks, where we looked at things like extent of possible harm, evidence of incorrect reasoning, is there missing content? But these metrics were arrived at based on the intuition of people who are sort of first looking at this problem. And I think there's a lot of work to be done here. Those are all looking at the answer from a clinician framework, but in general, these models will be used in products that will go to people, and people might approach this and have different answers of what the right answer is. So, for example, not only does the answer have to look good to a clinician who's kind of assessing the correctness from the expert's perspective, but it also has to actually satisfy the need of the user that it's serving. So, does this answer capture the user's intent? Is it answering the right question? Is the answer framed in a way that's helpful to the user, that helps them solve their problem? These kinds of things. So you can see it gets very complex very quickly. So taking those parts and kind of putting them into the larger picture of what does this mean? What are the big challenges going to be in evaluation here? As I mentioned before, the crux of the problem is kind of this difference in the number of outputs. For predictive AI, we have two to thousands of classifications. For generative AI, really it's almost infinite. When you start thinking about longer and longer text as potential outputs, the number of possible outputs gets astronomical very quickly. The metrics are fairly well worked out for predictive AI. We understand sensitivity, we understand specificity. These are things that are familiar to us. Generative AI, there's a large number of metrics that are being used. None of these are well accepted and widely accepted yet. Even the rubrics on which you're measuring things are not accepted yet. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Similarly, for predictive AI, one of the things that is important for especially post-market monitoring, where you're thinking about deploying these systems to larger scales and you're looking to measure whether it's doing a good job or not and monitor it, automation starts to become important for that kind of scale. And predictive AI is very automatable. You can count the number of times you got it right or wrong, and you can ship 1,000 images over with their grades and quickly have a computer go calculate what percentage you got right and wrong. That's not so easy with generative AI. If you've got a whole bunch of sort of text strings that are coming out of this, you need that human judgment element right now to go measure that. And that's slow, it's costly, and it doesn't scale well. But how do we expect this to go over time? And this is a little bit of sort of my personal prediction here. I think we'll see pretty rapid progress in the coming months and years towards a small number of metrics and standard evaluations that do become stable and widely accepted. We probably figure out a way to make it cost effective to do this at some sort of scale, have some level of automation in there. But I think it's likely that those are really only going to happen in the next several years for a pretty small subset of use cases for generative AI that are the most broadly deployed, right? These are going to be the areas that get the most funding and the most interest and the most research. And I think full, robust evaluation of kind of all the use cases we expect to see developing over time, that's going to take quite a bit longer. In particular, when you start to think about things like multimodal AI, where you're bringing in pictures and images and videos into this evaluation framework and kind of running into the same problems, but with whole new forms of media. So I think it's a great place for us to be investing. It's very important. It'll be key to making sure these models are deployed and sort of serve the world in a responsible way. So I hope to see a lot of work there in the future. With that, thank you very much for your time. Take care.
Great. Thank you so much. That concludes our speakers.